For this class, you'll be covering narrative and epic literature in context of contesting interpretations of the Dharma, looking at the Sanskrit epics. When we think about the Sanskrit epics, or even a broader category, the Hindu epics, the question becomes, well, what do we mean? The Hindu epics includes Sanskrit epics, epics that are written later in Hindi language, Tamil, Kannada epic poetry, Assamese epics, and Manipuri epics. Kavya refers to Sanskrit literary style poetry used by Indian court poets or South Asian court poets from between around 200 BCE to about 1200 of the Common Era. This literary style, which includes both poetry and a bit of prose, is characterized by abundant usage of figures of speech, metaphors, similes, and hyperbole to create its emotional effects. The result is a short lyrical court epic, which is narrative or dramatic. The kavya can refer to the style of the completed body of literature as well, so sometimes aspects of these epic poems in the Itihasa are referred to as kavya, although sometimes not. Ashvaghosha, a Buddhist philosopher and poet, is considered the father of this particular form of Sanskrit drama. Although it's important to note that Ashvaghosha's works are epics, but they aren't Hindu. There are also epics that are great epics by Tamil Jains that are written from 400 to around 1000 of the Common Era. I've listed the titles on the slide. These are epics, but they aren't Hindu epics. When we're speaking of the Hindu epics, we're mostly speaking of the Itihasa, which is attributed the Itihasa, which includes the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, as well as the Puranas. The Ramayana is attributed to the poet Valmiki, but we think it's really actually compiled over the course of several centuries and finalized in the Gupta period. The Mahabharata likewise is attributed to Vyasa, but we think that it's really compiled between about 400 before the Common Era and about 300 of the Common Era, finalized in the Gupta period. And you also have this big category of texts from the Itihasa, the Puranas, which describe these various sort of cosmological stories and mythological stories about the various Hindu gods that are associated with growth of temple Hinduism, which are composed and compiled from about 250 to about 1000 of the Common Era. So we're seeing a really dramatic growth of Hinduism from the composition of the Ramayana, which theoretically is oral at first and then written down, and then the Mahabharata, which is oral at first and then written down, and the Puranas, which are a collection of texts oral at first and then written down. So it's a dramatic transformation. But before we get into this a bit more, you might be asking to yourself, well, what do we mean by the Gupta period? Because if we're going to be examining the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the versions that we are examining today date back to that final solidification in the Gupta period. So the social context, the social milieu of the Gupta period is critical for interpreting and understanding these Hindu epics, these Sanskrit epics. The Gupta Empire was an ancient South Asian empire existing from the mid to late 3rd century of the Common Era through around the 6th century of the Common Era. At its zenith, from approximately 319 to 467, it covered much of the subcontinent as portrayed on the map on the right-hand side of the slide, and this period is considered a certain golden age of the Gupta Empire, golden age of pre-early modern or classical India in some senses. The ruling dynasty of the empire was founded by a Maharaj Sri Gupta, and we actually have the name Maharaj Sri Gupta from an inscription from that particular period. So we have written evidence of this particular figure literally carved into stone. The most notable rulers of the dynasty were Chandragupta, Samudragupta, and Chandragupta II, alias Vikramaditya. The 5th century of the Gupta Empire and the surrounding sort of areas are recorded in the context of the Sanskrit poet Kalidasa, who credits the Guptas with having conquered about 21 individual kingdoms. So I know that people were thinking about little kingdoms in other contexts. Let's just remember that this area is something like comparable to the size of the United States, perhaps, the contemporary United States. So massive amount of territory, and basically the entirety of Europe when we're talking about the entirety of South Asia. So a good chunk of it is a massive empire. These kingdoms might include the Parisikas, the Hunas, the Kambojas, and various groups that are recorded as, quote, tribes in Sanskrit, located to the west and east of the Oxus valleys, the Kinnaras, the Kiratas, and others. The high points of this period are the great cultural developments which took place primarily during the reigns of Samudragupta and Chandragupta II and Kumaragupta. There are many literary sources, such as the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, that are sort of canonized during this period in terms of their place in Hindu literature. The Gupta period produced a number of scholars, such as the aforementioned Kalidasa, but also Aryabhata, Varamihira, and Vatsyayana. These various scholars made great advancements in many academic fields, some of which we would now call science and political science. These are particular fields including research on siege weapons reached new heights during the Gupta era. So you have this massive imperial expansion associated with siege warfare, which is part of the backdrop of this history. The coins that you see on the lower left-hand side of the slides are actually extant gold coins from the period. So these are actually coins with the Gupta script on them, much like that carving from stone. And they were used to promote the recognition of a sort of trade network, common use of common currency, if you will. Now, the Guptas are traditionally interpreted as a Hindu dynasty, but there were a sort of orthoprax Hindu interpretation does not enforce their belief on the rest of the population, and it's important for us to understand that Buddhism and Jainism were absolutely widely accepted and sometimes even supported by the Guptas. So folks might have heard of the Sanchi Stupa, which is important during Ashoka's reign in the Mauryan Empire, preceding empire. This remained an important center of Buddhism. Kumaragupta from 414 to 455 is also said to have founded Nalanda, a major Buddhist university center during this period of time. Some later rulers, however, seem to have especially promoted Buddhism. So Narasimha Gupta, Baladitya, or just Narasimha Gupta for short, who's a latter 5th century, early 6th century possibly ruler, according to a contemporary writer, Parmartha, was brought up under the influence of the Mahayanist philosopher Vasubandhu. He built a Sanghavrama at Nalanda, so the sort of center, a Buddhist study center at Nalanda. He also constructed the center with a 300-foot high vihara with a Buddha statue with which, according to the Chinese monk H314, resembled the great vihara built under the Bodhi tree. According to the Manchu Srimulakalpa, which is a 8th to 9th century text, this king, so it's a text recording backwards, right? This king, Narasimha Gupta, became a Buddhist monk and left the world through meditation. So meditated literally as he reached nirvana at the end of his life. So practiced dhyana quite extensively. This Chinese monk who I referred to previously, Xuanzang, also noted that Narasimha Gupta Bhalatya Sang Vajra commissioned a Sangrama as well, which he possessed a great heart firm in faith, right? So there are Gupta rulers that are promoting Buddhism also. In the Gupta period, you have a solidification of a particular style of art, and I'm showing you several pieces here illustrative of the various religions. In one piece in the top right there, you've got the Dhammachakra Pravartana Buddha, so the Buddha while teaching at Sarnath. From the Gupta era, it's 5th century. Then just to the left of that, there's a sculpture of Vishnu from 5th century as well, in red sandstone. Then below that, you see a Shiva Mukhalinga, a lingam with a face on it. We'll discuss more about those later. It's from the Bhumara temple, from the same period. And then, from the same period, you have this Jain Tirthankara relief of Pashvanatha from the Kauham pillar, which is erected by Skanda Gupta. So you have these various representations of religions that are promoted in the Gupta Empire. So we're going to close here with just an introduction to the concept of Dharma in the Hindu epics. The meaning of the word Dharma depends on the context, and its meaning has evolved over the course of the history of Hinduism. In the earliest interpretations, Dharma means cosmic order, and the rules that created the universe from chaos, as well as the rituals in the later Vedas, the Upanishads, and the Puranas, and the epics. The meaning becomes refined, richer, and more complex, to say the least. The word was applied to diverse contexts. In certain contexts, Dharma designates human behaviors considered necessary for the order of things in the universe, the principles that prevent chaos, behaviors and actions necessary to all life in nature, society, behaviors and actions necessary to maintain a family, as well as those to promote individual well-being at the individual level. Dharma encompasses ideas such as duty, rights, character, vocation, religion, customs, rituals, and all behavior considered appropriate, correct, and morally upright. The antonym, of course, is adharma. Sanskrit antonyms are very simple. That way you just take the word and put an A in front of it. So there's dharma and adharma. This means not dharma. If something is adharmic, that is a not dharmic interpretation or a not dharmic action. The word adharma includes and implies many ideas in common parlance, such as those actions which are against nature, sometimes immoral, other words unethical, sometimes wrong, or sometimes unlawful. According to various Hindu traditions, Rama is an incarnation or an avatar of the god Vishnu, and the main purpose of this incarnation is to demonstrate the righteous path, Dharma being the righteous path here, for all living creatures on the earth. The Mahabharata offers one of the first instances of theorizing about the concept of Dharma Yuddha, or just war, in quotes, a just war, illustrating that many of the standards that would be debated later across the world about the concept of just war actually have very early precedents in this concept of Dharma Yuddha. In one story in the Mahabharata, one of the 5 brothers asks if the suffering caused by war can ever be justified. So this is one of the central questions to the Mahabharata. A long discussion then ensues between the siblings, establishing criteria like proportionality. Chariots cannot attack cavalry, only other chariots. It's just not fair, right? Or there's no attacking people in distress, right? Because that would be attacking civilians or something like this. There's also just means. Don't use barbed arrows, or no poisoning, and just cause. No attacking out of rage, and fair treatment of captives and the wounded, and other such concepts which are actually actively discussed and debated in this particular context. So for your post, go ahead and put up any concepts that jumped out to you or any questions that you might have, and let's get the discussion going.